The Kentucky sun was merciless that afternoon, scorching, unrelenting, and heavy enough to make the air shimmer above the cracked asphalt. A sleek black Mercedes sat parked on the side of a winding country road, its polished surface now gathering a thin layer of dust. Inside, behind tinted windows, an elderly man tapped his fingers impatiently on the leather steering wheel. His name was Richard Caldwell, a man whose name once carried weight in skyscraper boardrooms and on Wall Street tickers. He was the kind of man who had spent his life calculating risk, making deals worth millions, and building an empire brick by brick. Now retired, he was well into his 70s, living in a sprawling mansion just outside Lexington, Kentucky. Man who had spent decades controlling his world, his image, his destiny. But that afternoon, that world was reduced to a flat tire on a lonely stretch of road where cell service was more rumor than reality. Richard stared at the deflated rubber and muttered under his breath. He had made a dozen calls, but none connected. No roadside assistance, no chauffeur, no neatly pressed valet to solve the problem for him. For the first time in years, Richard Caldwell was truly stuck, and just when frustration threatened to boil over, when the heat, the silence, and the helplessness seemed unbearable, he saw him, a boy, 13, maybe 14 years old, walking barefoot down the roadside gravel. His t-shirt was faded, his shorts too big, and his sneakers, if you could even call them sneakers, were slung over his shoulder, soles peeling away. His hair was messy, his skin browned by the summer sun, but his stride carried a certain determination. Richard narrowed his eyes. The boy wasn't hesitating, wasn't wandering. He was headed straight toward him. "Car trouble, sir?" the boy asked, his voice steady but polite. Richard blinked. "Flat tire," he admitted, almost embarrassed. "And no way to call for help." The boy didn't laugh or sneer. He simply nodded, studying the car with sharp, focused eyes. "I can fix it. My uncle showed me how." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You? Fix this?" He gestured at the Mercedes, as if its luxury somehow made the task more complicated. But the boy only smiled faintly. "A tire's a tire, sir. Doesn't matter what car it's on." And without waiting for permission, the boy crouched down beside the wheel. His hands were small, calloused, and quick. In moments, he had the trunk open, tools spread neatly on the gravel, and the spare positioned. Richard found himself watching, oddly transfixed. This boy, this stranger with nothing but worn clothes and scraped knees, moved with more confidence than half the Ivy League interns he had once hired. When the job was done, the boy stood, wiping his hands on his shorts. "All set," he said simply, as if it were nothing. Richard reached into his wallet, pulling out crisp bills. "Here," he said, offering the boy a generous tip, but the boy stepped back, shaking his head. "No, thank you, sir. I don't need money. Just glad to help." Richard froze. He had lived a life where everything had a price, where nothing, absolutely nothing, came without strings. Yet here stood a boy, refusing payment with nothing more than a smile. And before Richard could argue, the boy was already walking away, barefoot, shoulders straight, disappearing into the heat haze of the Kentucky road. Richard sat back in the driver's seat, unsettled. For the first time in a long while, a stranger had left him speechless. That night, Richard sat in his cavernous study, nursing a glass of scotch as the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background. He had faced CEOs, politicians, and billionaires, but it was the memory of a boy with worn sneakers that refused to leave his mind. He couldn't explain why it bothered him, why the image of the boy rejecting money, walking away with nothing. But quiet dignity weighed heavier than any deal gone wrong, and by morning, curiosity had grown into something stronger. Richard Caldwell was a man who hated unfinished business, and this boy felt unfinished, so he made a decision. He was going to find him. The search took him through small towns and diners scattered across rural Kentucky. Everywhere he went, he asked the same question. "Do you know a boy? About this tall, skinny, walks barefoot sometimes? Help me change a tire?" Most people shrugged. Some gave polite smiles. Hours passed. Finally, in a faded corner cafe, a waitress wiping down tables paused. "Sounds like you're talking about Malik," she said. "That boy's always lending a hand around here. Lives with his mama outside a place called Claiborne." Richard nodded, committing the name to memory. Claiborne was a modest town nestled near the Appalachian foothills. The kind of place where front porches sagged, fences leaned, and neighbors knew every detail of each other's lives. For Richard, who spent decades in penthouses and marble-floored lobbies, it felt like stepping into another world. After a few more questions to locals, he found himself parked outside a small, weather-beaten house. The paint peeled, the roof sagged, but the yard was neatly kept. Flowers bloomed in old tin cans along the porch steps, and laundry swayed on a clothesline. Richard hesitated before knocking. For once, he didn't know what to say. The door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. She looked tired, eyes shadowed from long days, but there was a strength about her, a quiet resilience. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "Good afternoon," Richard began, clearing his throat. I believe I met your son yesterday. Malik, isn't it? He helped me with a flat tire." The woman's expression softened instantly. A hint of pride lit her weary face. "That sounds like my boy," she said with a small smile. "Always helping folks. He's out back, mending the fence." Richard stepped inside at her invitation. The house was modest, the furniture mismatched, the walls decorated with family photos and children's drawings. Yet despite its worn appearance, the home radiated warmth. Out back, Malik stood with a hammer in hand, patching together the fence with scraps of wood. He looked up, startled at first, but quickly broke into that same easy smile. "Sir, didn't think I'd see you again." Richard chuckled awkwardly. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday. I wanted to thank you properly." Malik shrugged. "No need for that, just did what anybody would." But Richard knew better. Most people he had met in his long life wouldn't have lifted a finger without asking, "What's in it for me?" And this boy had walked away without a second thought. For the first time in years, Richard Caldwell felt humbled. If you were Richard in that moment, offering money and having the boy refuse it, what would you think? Would you feel embarrassed or inspired? Let me know in the comments. Richard Caldwell had closed billion-dollar deals in glass towers. He had faced competitors who wanted to crush him, auditors who wanted to expose him, and journalists who wanted to bring him down. Yet here, standing in a backyard that smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh soil, he felt more nervous than he had in decades. Malik leaned casually against the half-mended fence, a hammer dangling loosely from his hand. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he couldn't quite figure out why this wealthy stranger had bothered to find him again. Richard cleared his throat. "You helped me when you didn't have to, and you didn't ask for anything in return. That means something to me. I'd like to do something for you and your family." Malik shook his head instantly. "We're okay, sir. Honest. My mom works hard and I help where I can." Richard studied him. There was no defensiveness in his tone. Just matter-of-fact sincerity. No complaint, no self-pity. For a boy who had so little, Malik carried himself with a pride that some billionaires lacked. At that moment, Malik's mother stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Malik, lunch is ready," she called, then glanced at Richard. "You're welcome to join us. It's nothing fancy, but you're welcome." Richard hesitated. He hadn't been a guest in a stranger's kitchen in, well, he couldn't even remember. His dinners were usually plated by chefs, served under chandeliers, paired with imported wine. Yet something about her tone, genuine, unpolished, left him no room to decline. "I'd be honored," he said quietly. The kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, but it was set with care. Richard, in his tailored suit, felt completely out of place. But Malik and his mother chatted easily, drawing him into their rhythm. Malik talked about school, about his dreams of becoming an engineer one day. "I like building things, fixing things. Feels like making order out of chaos." His mother shared stories about their community, how neighbors helped one another, how every hardship was softened by someone showing up at your door with soup or tools or just an extra pair of hands. Richard listened, oddly captivated. He had spent his life in a different universe, one where connections were transactional and friendships were leveraged for power. Yet here, in this modest kitchen, there was laughter, warmth, and an ease that money could never buy. For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him. Later, as he stood to leave, Richard paused at the door. "You've raised a remarkable boy," he told Malik's mother, his voice heavier than he expected. She smiled faintly. "Thank you. We don't have much, but we've learned to be grateful for what we do have." Those words followed Richard all the way back to his mansion. That night, alone in his vast study, he stared at the marble fireplace, the polished wood shelves, the paintings worth more than most houses, and for the first time, his fortune felt hollow. Because what Malik's family had, connection, resilience, gratitude, was something Richard had long lost. And so he made a decision. He would give something back, not because they needed it, but because he did. The next morning, Richard's phone calls began. Contractors, suppliers, old colleagues who owed him favors. Within days, trucks arrived in Claiborne. Neighbors gathered curiously as materials piled up outside Malik's home. Richard stood at the curb with a clipboard, directing the work like a general on a battlefield. The roof was patched, the porch rebuilt, the rusted swing set in the backyard replaced with a sturdy new one. Inside, walls were painted, the kitchen upgraded, the floors polished. Malik and his mother protested at first. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "We've managed on our own just fine." Richard shook his head. "You didn't manage. You thrive, and you reminded me what life is supposed to be about. Let me do this, not as charity, but as thanks." For Malik, the weeks that followed were unforgettable. At first, he tried to help with the renovations, carrying planks, sweeping dust. But Richard smiled and said, "Your job is to enjoy being a kid for a little while." Still, Malik couldn't resist sneaking out to watch. He peppered the workers with questions about drills, about angles, about how to measure a cut so precisely. One burly carpenter named Joe finally laughed. "Kid, you've got the curiosity of an apprentice. Here, hold the tape for me." From then on, Malik was part of the crew. He measured wood, handed out nails, studied every move with wide-eyed fascination. And Richard, watching from a distance, felt something he hadn't in years. Pride. Not the kind that came from a quarterly profit or a headline in the Times, but the pride of seeing potential blossom in someone young, someone unspoiled by greed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the last nails were hammered, Richard stood with Malik on the new porch. The boy's eyes gleamed as he looked over the house. Transformed before him. "Feels like a new beginning," Malik murmured. Richard looked at him, his voice quiet. "It is, for both of us." But neither of them realized just how true those words would become. Because while the house was nearly finished, Richard's plan for Malik and the impact it would have was only just beginning. Richard thought he was simply fixing a house. But what he was about to offer Malik next would go far beyond wood and paint. It would open doors neither of them could have imagined. If you were in Malik's shoes, watching strangers renovate your home, would you feel grateful or uncomfortable? Drop your honest thoughts below. The house stood gleaming under the afternoon sun, freshly painted and whole again. Neighbors whispered in awe, some even snapping photos, as if Malik's modest home had become a symbol of something bigger. Hope, rebirth, maybe even magic. But Richard Caldwell wasn't done. Not yet. After the last truck rolled away, Richard gathered Malik and his mother on the new porch. His voice was steady, but there was a glint of nervousness in his eyes. "You've given me more than you'll ever know," he began. "And I don't just mean that day with the car. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. What matters most." Malik's mother frowned gently. "Mr. Caldwell, you've already done more than enough." Richard raised a hand. "Please, let me finish." He turned to Malik. "Son, you said you wanted to build things, to make order out of chaos. That's a rare gift, and I want to help you chase it." From his briefcase, Richard pulled out a folder. Inside was a scholarship fund contract, paid in full, covering Malik's education all the way through college. Engineering, architecture, whatever he wanted. Malik's eyes went wide. You do that for me?" Richard nodded. "I'd be honored to." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Malik's mother pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. She tried to speak, but the words dissolved into a sob. Malik stood frozen, gripping the folder with trembling fingers, as though afraid it might vanish if he let go. And in that instant, Richard realized he hadn't just changed their lives, they had changed his. From that day forward, Richard Caldwell became more than a benefactor. He became a mentor. He visited often, checking in on Malik's grades, sitting with him at the kitchen table to go over math problems, or walking him through blueprints from his own business ventures. Malik absorbed everything like a sponge, his determination growing sharper with each passing year. But the relationship wasn't one-sided. Malik, with his endless curiosity and unshakable optimism, gave Richard something priceless in return: purpose. For decades, Richard had measured success in profits and stock values, but now he found joy in moments money couldn't buy. Malik proudly showing him a straight-A report card. Malik's mother hugging him after Malik's first science fair win. Malik sketching a bridge design and saying, "One day I'll build this for real." And slowly, Richard's life shifted. He smiled more. He worked less. His board meetings no longer consumed him, because he knew his legacy wasn't in skyscrapers or companies. It was in the boy who had once stopped on a roadside to help a stranger in need. Years passed. Malik grew, from high school to college, then into internships where his skills dazzled mentors and left professors nodding with pride. Richard was there through it all, sometimes in the background, sometimes right beside him, but always steady, always supportive. One evening, long after Malik had graduated, the two sat together on that same porch where where it had all begun. The air was warm, filled with the chirp of crickets and the hum of a world moving forward. Richard, older now, leaned back in his chair. "You've done well, Malik, better than I ever dreamed." Malik looked at him, his voice firm with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Richard shook his head. "No, you could have. All I did was open a door. You're the one who walked through it." Malik smiled, but there was a seriousness in his eyes. "Then let me ask you something. When I'm successful enough, when I can finally give back, how do I know where to start?" Richard's gaze softened. He gestured around them, the house, the porch, the community that had grown stronger since those days. "You start here," he said simply, "right where you stand. Find someone who needs a door opened and hold it for them the way you held it for me." That night, Malik lay in bed, wide awake, his heart burning with determination. He knew his life wasn't just his own anymore. It carried Richard's belief, his mother's sacrifices, and the countless small moments that had shaped him. And in that quiet realization, Malik found his true calling, not just to build bridges of steel or concrete, but to build bridges between people, bridges of kindness, of opportunity, of second chances. And maybe that's the real twist here. Richard thought he was saving Malik, but in the end, Malik saved him by giving him a reason to live for something greater than wealth. Do you think the prosecutor, in this case the system, should hold people accountable for ignoring kids like Malik until someone powerful steps in? Or is it up to us as individuals to create change? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Life has a strange way of weaving people together. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a boy stopping to help a stranded stranger, can ripple outward to change not just one life, but two. It reminds us that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the legacies we leave behind. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we've got more incredible stories coming your way.